The federal government will be setting a 2-year cap on permits for international students. Immigration Minister Mark Miller says the main goal is to target what could be hundreds of institutional bad actors that are exploiting international students. But not everyone is on board with this solution.
This is really a moment where we see that the federal government is trying to address the crisis, but it's missing the mark.
This cap comes at a time when Ontario universities are already facing a cash crunch. Tuition was frozen 5 years ago after being cut by 10%, and university funding has remained low. At least 10 universities were already forecasting a combined operating deficit of $175 million, with that deficit expected to grow next year to $273 million, and that's before factoring in the potential impact of the student permit cap. Steve Orsini is the president and CEO of the Council of Ontario Universities, and he joins me now. Steve Orsini, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Those numbers are not great when you add them up, and I know Minister Miller is targeting more private colleges, it seems, with these measures, but how significant could these financial implications be for your members?
Well, we believe they're significant. We agree with the federal objective of trying to manage the growth of international students. What we don't agree with is the blunt approach they're taking. They're having unintended consequences to universities as we speak. They're suspending applications were effective Monday. So suddenly we have universities that have been enrolling students for decades, that have managed the enrollment growth, that provide housing and support services. Now their students are anxious. They don't know whether they'll get a supporting letter from the province, and they don't know whether or not the federal government, how long it will take to approve their application. This is having direct, immediate impacts now.
When you look at those financial numbers that I laid out there off the top, $250 million in combined deficits. I mean, we've seen universities like Queen's, which is a big name in Canadian academics, having to draw down $62 million in reserves just to make a go of things. What will this do to the financial bottom line of a lot of institutions in Ontario?
Well, it's going to exacerbate the difficult financial situation universities are in. As you pointed out, there's at least 10 universities reporting operating deficits. And we know, based on the Ontario government's own expert panel, that universities in Ontario are funded at 57% of the national average. That the decline in real per student funding has been declining for years. And Ontario's government's own expert panel said the cut and freeze to tuition has reduced its value by 25%. Now you throw on the federal cap. That's a blunt instrument. It's not really targeting exactly who the federal government's concerned about, because it's lumping everyone in. That's going to erode our finances further. What does that mean? It means student services are at risk. We're seeing universities cut programs in student services, and this will only be magnified unless the federal government can better target who they want to go after.
So how can the federal government do that when post-secondary education is constitutionally the purview of the provinces, right? And it seems, my interpretation, maybe I'm wrong on this, is that there was a frustration at the federal level from a lack of action at provincial levels to rein this in that kind of led to this step being taken. So you wanted a more surgical solution. What is a more surgical solution at the federal government level when all of these colleges that they're concerned about are regulated by provinces?
Well, the federal government has the data, which is why they're concerned and they oppose this blunt cap. For example, approval rates. The federal government knows that, for example, universities have very high approval rates. They take time to scrutinize and sort through who's applying for enrollment at an Ontario university. Some organizations take 4 or 5 applications to get one through. So that's the first thing. They could rank applications by the quality of the applicant, and they can do that by approval rates. They can also look at whether or not institutions have a code of conduct with their agents. It's all about accountability. Every university requires a code of conduct between the university and the agent to make sure the agents are explaining to their students or the applicants the cost of tuition, cost of living, and other costs related to them moving to Ontario. Unless these students are informed of those costs, they won't be prepared coming to Ontario. The federal government has that information, or it's easily collectible. So the federal government was consulting on this trusted institution model and then abandoned it at the last minute and used a stopgap measure that's causing implications as we speak.
Right, but is that because they weren't getting buy-in, they weren't getting cooperation, or the numbers were just rising too dramatically? I was looking through the annual report of an Ontario college today that has enrollment go up by more than 10,000 in a year. It saw its revenue increase by well over $100 million in a year, largely driven by international student recruitment. And they don't necessarily have the infrastructure that a university would have in place, for example, with a university senate and residences and all of these things that manage it. So why do you think that they acted the way they did?
Well, you're going to have to ask the federal government, but they had this information. In fact, when they announced a 2-year cap, they said they're going to resume this trusted institution model 2 years from now. So they're actually committed to implementing that program. All we're saying is, could you implement it faster? Because you're having unintended consequences. You're impacting all universities. If you look at university as a group, their enrollment has flatlined over the last few years. We haven't had this explosive growth in international students. We have housing programs. So I think a targeted approach would avoid what we think are dramatic impacts that's going to impact universities that the federal government never intended to affect.
Okay, so this is too blunt of an instrument, but there's still the issue of the bad actor colleges, as Mark Miller describes them. What do you need to see from the provincial government here to help alleviate this? Because if you weed out some of the less credible institutions that are causing some of these problems, it protects your members in a way because they're seen as credible and reliable post-secondary educators. What does the Ford government, for example, need to do on this in Ontario?
Well, we know the Ontario government's still sorting through what this means, and we're prepared to work with the province. The province had an expert panel report last fall, and the expert panel recommended that the federal government, and we presume the Ontario government would follow their advice, is to go with this recognized institution model. So where the federal government couldn't deliver on it, we're hoping that the province can follow through on that. Measure the performance of each organization. Are they providing the supports? Do they have housing? Are they holding their agents accountable? We believe the federal government is committed to that. They've indicated they want to resume that, and we think it's an opportunity for the province to follow up on where the federal government left off.
Steve Orsini, thanks for joining us tonight. If you hear of more developments on all of this, please reach out and we'll have you back. Steve Orsini is the President and CEO of the Council of Ontario Universities. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.